You tried. That's the part no one saw. You stayed loyal when it was easier to walk away. You made excuses for their behavior, convinced yourself they'd change, told your heart to hold on just a little longer. You put them first. You laughed when you were hurting. You stayed when your soul was begging to leave. Not because you were weak, but because you cared. You thought they'd see your worth if you just loved harder, showed up more, stayed quiet, stayed kind. But the truth is, some people never notice what they don't value, and some only value what they lose. Being surrounded by people who don't value you doesn't feel like abuse. It feels like quiet suffering. It's subtle. It creeps in. It's being the one who always listens but never gets asked, "How are you really?" It's showing up to support but not being remembered when you need support. It's a text left unanswered, a plan constantly rescheduled, a conversation that always turns back to them, and still you stay. You tell yourself loyalty means holding on. You confuse love with tolerance. You trade your worth for connection, and that trade always costs more than it gives. The hardest part is knowing that if you stopped reaching out, the connection would die. And that's how you know. That's how you know you're not valued. That's how you know it's time. There's no announcement, no grand betrayal, just silence, indifference, distance that feels like rejection. You start to feel smaller around them. You start to question if maybe you're too sensitive, too needy, too much. You're not. You've just been walking with people who prefer your silence over your truth. People who don't clap when you win. People who disappear when you lose. That's not love. That's not friendship. That's not real. It takes courage to stand alone. Not because being alone is hard, but because being alone means facing what you've allowed for too long. It means no longer shrinking to stay. It means walking away, not because they pushed you, but because you finally saw they were never standing with you. You just didn't want to accept it. You kept hoping. That hope kept you hurting. But there's peace on the other side of letting go. There's a quiet strength in choosing solitude over disrespect. It doesn't mean you hate them. It means you love yourself more than you love being tolerated. People will ask why you changed, why you stopped showing up, why you pulled back. And the answer will never sound dramatic, it will sound honest. Because you finally realized you don't have to prove your worth to anyone. You don't have to beg to be respected. You don't have to break yourself to keep connections alive. You're allowed to outgrow spaces where you're not seen. You're allowed to walk alone, even if it scares you. Because being alone and valued by yourself is better than being surrounded and silently broken. You stayed longer than you should have, not because you were weak, but because your heart is strong, because you believed in people, because you gave them chances they didn't deserve. You wanted to see the best in them. You held on, even when the silence was louder than their love, even when the signs were clear. You kept showing up. You stayed because you didn't want to give up on people who had already given up on you, quietly. There's a kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from physical work. It comes from constantly trying to be enough for people who treat you like an afterthought. You become a shell of yourself. You keep giving. You keep adjusting. You say yes when you want to say no. You suppress your needs. You shrink to fit into their comfort zone. But the truth is, no matter how small you make yourself, it will never be enough for people who don't see your value. One of the worst things isn't being alone. It's being surrounded by people who make you feel like you are. You sit at tables where you're not fed emotionally. You're present but not noticed. You talk, but they don't hear you. They ask how you are but never wait for the answer. You become background noise, a filler, a safety net. You're there for them when they fall apart, but when you're the one breaking, it's silent. No one checks in. no one reaches out. That kind of silence isn't peaceful. It's loud in the worst way. It echoes. It makes you question your worth. It makes you feel like you're too much and never enough at the same time. And yet, you stay, because leaving feels heavier, because you've convinced yourself they might change, because you've attached your worth to how they treat you. And that becomes the most dangerous lie you tell yourself. The cost of staying is slow, but it's real. It's in the way your laughter becomes less frequent, the way your energy fades, the way your confidence weakens. You start doubting yourself. You think you're overreacting. You tell yourself it's not that bad, but it is. It is that bad when you're the only one trying. It's that bad when you feel disposable, when your love becomes a convenience, not a priority. People talk about heartbreak like it only happens in romantic relationships. But there's a special kind of pain that comes from being undervalued by the people you call friends, or family, or teammates. They don't need to say anything cruel. Sometimes it's in the way they forget you, or only reach out when they need something, or how they remember your mistakes but forget your loyalty. That kind of hurt sits quietly inside you, and it grows until you start doubting if kindness was ever worth it. You keep showing up to places that don't feel like home. You attend events, you answer calls, you smile in photos. But inside it's empty, because you know these people wouldn't notice if you disappeared. Not really. They would ask, eventually, but not because they miss you, because they need something from you. That realization can break something in you. It makes you cautious. It hardens parts of you that were once soft and giving. They make you precautious at it. It hardens parts of you that were once soft and giving. You learn to stop speaking first. You stop explaining your side. You stop apologizing for asking for basic respect. Because after a while it becomes clear, if someone wanted to value you, they would have done it already. You start to see that presence isn't the same as support. Just because they're around doesn't mean they care. Just because they laugh with you doesn't mean they'll cry with you. You start noticing the difference between real and convenient. He, you. And when you stay, even after you know you're not seen, you start abandoning yourself. You choose them over your peace. You stay quiet to keep the peace while a war rages inside you. You fake happiness, you wear masks. You show up when you're empty. That level of self-abandonment isn't sustainable. It takes a toll on your body, your spirit, your sense of self. You begin to forget what you need, what you want, who you are without them. You give so much of yourself that when you're finally alone, you're not sure what's left. The cost isn't always obvious. It shows up slowly, in burnout, in anxiety, in the way your shoulders stay tense, in the way you dread phone calls, in the way you keep silent about things that matter. That's the cost. Losing yourself to keep them. You shouldn't have to beg to be understood. You shouldn't have to plead to be respected. You shouldn't have to prove your worth every day. And yet, when you stay in spaces that undervalue you, that's exactly what you end up doing. Constantly trying to earn something that should be given freely. Kindness, consideration, care. What people don't talk about enough is how heavy loyalty feels when it's one-sided. When you stay for love, but they stay for benefit. When you defend people who wouldn't do the same for you. When you lower your standards because being mistreated feels better than being alone. But that's a lie. Loneliness is painful, but nothing is lonelier than being surrounded by people who don't really see you. You deserve to be where you are celebrated, not tolerated. Where your voice is heard, not silenced. Where your presence brings joy, not convenience. Staying in the wrong place doesn't make you loyal. It makes you invisible. And the longer you stay, the harder it becomes to leave. You start thinking, maybe this is all you'll ever get, that maybe you expect too much, but you don't. You've just accepted too little for too long, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away, not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect, out of the decision to finally choose yourself over people who never chose you. Not because you're angry, but because you're done paying the price for staying where you were never truly valued. Sometimes the signs are subtle. They don't always come with loud arguments or clear betrayals. Often they show up in small, quiet ways, the kind that's easy to ignore at first, but they build slowly, consistently, until one day you're left questioning your worth without even knowing why. You start to feel drained after being around them, not tired from conversation, but exhausted in your chest, like you've been carrying something heavy that isn't yours. You notice they rarely ask how you're really doing. If they do, it's in passing, a quick "how are you?" before shifting the focus back to themselves. Your words don't seem to land. Your emotions feel brushed aside. They listen, but they don't hear. They speak over you. Your opinions are often dismissed. When you express your thoughts, it feels like they're already preparing a reply, not to understand, but to defend. The conversation becomes a competition. It stops being a space to connect and becomes a stage for them to perform. Your wins are met with silence, maybe even slight annoyance. But your mistakes, those are remembered, brought up, highlighted, sometimes even joked about in front of others. You begin to apologize more for things you shouldn't feel sorry about, for having needs, for being sensitive, for speaking up. They act like your standards are demands, like your emotions are inconveniences. You question yourself constantly. Did I overreact? Was I being too much? That confusion is a sign, a quiet alarm that something isn't right. They only show up when it's easy for them, when it's convenient, when they need something. But when you need support, they're too busy, too tired, suddenly unreachable. They expect your presence without offering theirs in return. You give effort, energy, time. They give excuses, and yet you still try. You still show up because you care, because loyalty is natural to you. They mock what matters to you. Subtle sarcasm, little digs masked as jokes. They don't have to say they don't respect you. It shows in how they treat the things you care about. Your dreams, your passions, your boundaries. They become topics for ridicule. You try to laugh it off, but inside something stings. That sting is your self-worth speaking. Conversations feel like negotiations. You can't be fully honest without fearing a reaction. You filter yourself. You shrink. You silence opinions that may upset them, not because you're wrong, but because you're tired of the tension. That tension shouldn't exist with people who claim to care. You notice their support has conditions. They're there when you're agreeable, when you're easy, when you're useful. But if you ever speak up, if you ever say no, suddenly you're difficult, you're too much. They start pulling back, withholding affection, disguising manipulation as emotional distance. They compete with you. When something good happens in your life, they find a way to bring the spotlight back to themselves. You're never allowed to have your moment. They interrupt your story with their own. You can feel it. Your happiness annoys them. Their congratulations feel forced. There are moments when you test them. You stop texting first. You hold back from checking in, and days go by. Maybe weeks. Silence. No follow-up. No concern. That's when you realize you were the glue, the one holding it all together. They didn't care as much as you thought. They cared about your presence, not your well-being. They minimize what hurts you. You open up about pain and they say, "You're too sensitive." They make you feel like your feelings are wrong, like your emotional truth is an overreaction. It's a tactic, intentional or not, to keep you second-guessing, to keep the power tilted. You feel isolated even when they're around. That's one of the hardest things to explain, how you can feel invisible in a room full of people, how your laughter feels empty when you're with them. You question if it's all in your head, but it's not. It's real. You're not being dramatic, you're just finally seeing clearly. They don't celebrate your growth. The better you become, the colder they get. It's not always obvious, but there's a distance, a subtle shift. It's because your growth threatens their comfort. People who truly value you want to see you rise. They clap when you win. They show up when you're low. They don't disappear when you shine. You hold on longer than you should because you remember the beginning, the laughs, the connection, the memories. But time doesn't excuse the present. You can love what you had and still walk away from what it's become. These signs aren't loud. They creep in slowly. But your body knows. Your energy knows. If you feel smaller around them, if you feel anxious after every interaction, if you feel unseen, pay attention. The truth is in how you feel, not in what they say. And when someone truly values you, you'll never have to question whether they do. You stayed because it was familiar. Even if it hurt, even if it drained you, it felt safer than the unknown. There's something about routine, even painful routine, that makes people stay longer than they should. You told yourself it wasn't that bad. You made excuses for the way they treated you. You gave them the benefit of the doubt. Again and again. You held on to hope, thinking maybe if you just tried harder, gave more, were more patient, they'd finally see your worth. You believed in potential. You saw the best in people who only showed you the worst. You remembered the one time they were kind, the rare moment they made you feel seen, and you held on to that like it was enough to justify the rest. You forgave things you shouldn't have, not because you lacked standards, but because your heart was big. You stayed loyal to people who couldn't even stay consistent. You confused loyalty with self-sacrifice. You thought staying made you strong. In a way, it did. It takes strength to keep trying, but strength, when misused, turns into suffering. Sometimes you stayed because you were scared. Scared of what would come after. Scared of starting over. Scared of being alone. You convinced yourself that being surrounded by people who didn't value you was better than being by yourself. Loneliness can feel like an empty room, but so can being surrounded by the wrong people. The truth is, fear made you quiet. It made you shrink yourself. You stopped voicing your needs because every time you did, you were made to feel difficult or dramatic, so you learned to stay silent, to smile when it hurt, to make peace with disrespect. You also stayed because you cared, and that's not a weakness. You genuinely wanted to make it work. You wanted to fix things. You thought if you loved hard enough, you could heal what was broken. You thought you could be enough for both of you, so you kept pouring from an empty cup. You kept giving while they kept taking, and every time you thought about leaving, you felt guilty, not because you owed them something, but because you were raised to believe that walking away meant quitting, so you were coming back. Dude, that standing up for yourself meant hurting others. So instead you hurt yourself. And sometimes you stayed because you saw parts of yourself in them. Maybe you related to their pain. Maybe you wanted to be the person who stayed when everyone else left them. You thought your presence could be their healing, that your love could be their anchor. But people have to want to be better. They have to want to change. You can't heal someone who keeps cutting you open. You can't carry both their wounds and your own. Still, you tried. There were days you almost walked away. You thought about what life would feel like without their silence, their criticism, their distance. But then doubt crept in. What if no one else comes? What if I regret this? What if it's just me who's the problem? You questioned yourself more than you questioned them. That's what emotional neglect does. It twists your mind. It makes you overthink every word, every glance, every interaction. You become so used to not being heard that eventually you stop speaking up. There's also a part of you that didn't want to disappoint anyone. You were the strong one, the reliable one, the one who didn't complain. And admitting that this situation wasn't right, that meant admitting that you let it go on for too long. That kind of honesty is painful. It forces you to face the time you've lost, the versions of yourself you buried just to stay. But even in that silence, there was still love. You loved them, even when they didn't love you in return the way you deserved. You stayed because of memories. You remembered the good times, even if they were few and far between. You replayed them in your mind, hoping they'd return. You gave chance after chance, thinking that if you just held on a little longer, they'd go back to who they were in the beginning. But sometimes people don't change. Sometimes the version they showed you at the start was just a mask. And you, being the caring soul that you are, fell in love with the man, not the reality. You also stayed because it's hard to admit you were wrong. You invested time, energy, emotion. You built dreams around people who were never building with you. Letting go felt like wasting everything. But it wasn't wasted. It taught you. It shaped you. Every tear, every silent night, every moment you questioned your worth, it all built a stronger version of you. But in the moment, it felt like failure. Like you couldn't make something work that should have. And that burden didn't belong to you, but you carried it anyway. Your loyalty is rare. Your heart is rare. The fact that you stayed says nothing about weakness. It says everything about how much you care, how much you believed, how willing you were to give people chances they didn't even ask for. That's something the world needs more of. But now, you're learning the difference between staying and settling, between caring and carrying too much, between love and self-abandonment. You stayed because you had hope, but hope without effort from the other side becomes pain. You stayed longer than you should have, but it's okay. What matters now is that you see it, that you recognize your value, that you no longer blame yourself for their inability to treat you right. The fact that you stayed says you gave them every chance, and the fact that you're even thinking about walking away now means you're finally starting to give yourself one. There comes a moment that doesn't always feel loud. It's not dramatic. No slamming doors, no final arguments. No one storms out. Sometimes it happens in silence. You're sitting there, maybe in a room full of people, or maybe scrolling through messages that never came, and it just hits you. They don't care the way you do. You've been showing up, holding space, giving chances, and none of it has been returned. The energy has always been one-sided. The effort, too. And in that stillness, something in you just breaks, but not the kind of break that shatters. It's the kind that wakes you up. You start replaying every moment, all the times you lowered your voice just to keep the peace, all the times you swallowed your thoughts to avoid conflict, all the excuses you made for why they didn't show up for you, the late replies, the forgotten promises, the cold silences that you warmed with your patience. You thought if you loved them harder, maybe they'd see you, but they didn't. They saw your loyalty as something permanent, something they never had to earn. They saw your consistency as something they could lean on, not something they should appreciate. And suddenly, all those small things you brushed off now feel loud. The subtle disrespect, the dismissive tone, the way they only checked on you when they needed something, the way your wins were ignored, your pain minimized, your presence taken for granted. You always had to explain your worth, prove your loyalty, show your heart, and they never had to do the same. You realize you've been shrinking yourself just to stay close. You laughed when it wasn't funny. You agreed when you didn't. You tolerated when you should have walked away. And now you can't unsee it. That clarity is painful. It's not relief at first. It's grief. Because you start mourning a version of the relationship that only existed in your hope. You wanted to believe they cared as much as you did. You wanted to believe they'd change. But truth has a way of cutting through illusion. The worst part isn't their behavior. It's how long you tolerated it. You're angry, but mostly at yourself, for knowing better and still staying, for seeing the signs and still hoping. But even in that anger, there's something else. Acceptance. You stop explaining, you stop chasing, you stop pouring into empty hands, not because you stopped loving, but because you started loving yourself more. It's hard to admit someone doesn't value you. That realization feels like failure, like you weren't good enough. But it's not about you. It never was. Some people only know how to take. Some only know how to care when it's convenient. And no matter how much love you give, it'll never teach them how to treat you right. That's a hard truth to hold, but it's real. In that moment, you start choosing silence over explaining, boundaries over begging, distance over dysfunction. You understand that not everyone who walks with you wants you to win. Not everyone who smiles is sincere. And not everyone who stays deserves a seat. It's a shift, and it changes how you carry yourself. You stop waiting for the apology that will never come. You stop expecting them to act right just because you did. You stop giving them the benefit of the doubt when their actions have already told you the truth, and you start listening to what's not being said. Because absence speaks, neglect speaks, indifference speaks, louder than words ever will. It's not bitterness, it's clarity. You realize you'd rather be alone with your peace than surrounded by people who make you question your worth. You start craving quiet over chaos. You value yourself more. You become protective, not just of your time, but of your energy, your presence, your love. There's no big announcement, no dramatic goodbye. You don't need to prove anything. You just stop showing up where you're not valued. You stop reaching out to people who don't reach back. You stop hoping they'll change. And in that choice, you find freedom. That moment becomes a turning point. The way you think, speak, walk, it all shifts. You don't explain your value anymore. You don't ask for attention. You don't chase. Because now you know, anyone who makes you feel hard to love isn't your people. Anyone who sees your light and still chooses to shade it was never for you. The silence that follows is healing, and you realize that letting go isn't losing, it's choosing you. And that's not something to be ashamed of, it's something to honor. Because the moment you realize they don't value you is the moment you start valuing yourself for real this time. But it doesn't happen all at once. It creeps in slowly. The realization that something's wrong, that staying is starting to cost more than you can afford to keep paying. You feel it before you can say it. That tightness in your chest, the way your smile starts to feel like a performance, the way your energy drains around them but not around others. That moment from before, the clarity you couldn't ignore, it planted something inside you. A small truth you couldn't unsee. That you were showing up for people who wouldn't do the same for you. That your presence was convenient, not cherished. And now you're standing in the quiet space between knowing and acting. The courage to leave doesn't arrive with a shout. It whispers. It comes on the hardest nights, when you sit with your own thoughts and finally stop making excuses for them. You remember how many chances you gave, how many versions of yourself you became to keep the peace. You lowered your standards, softened your words, made yourself smaller just to be enough for people who were never enough for you. And still, it wasn't good enough. Still, they rolled their eyes when you needed understanding. Still, they disappeared when things got hard for you, but expected you to show up when they snapped their fingers. That's what makes it so painful. Realizing that your loyalty wasn't matched, that your kindness was used, not valued. It's not anger that hits first, it's grief. You start mourning the version of you that stayed too long. The one who waited for their appreciation, their recognition, their care. The one who didn't know how powerful it was to leave. It's not easy. People talk about walking away like it's a decision you make once, but the truth is, you make it every single day. Every time you stop yourself from texting them first. Every time you choose your peace over their chaos. Every time you fight the guilt that tells you maybe it wasn't so bad. Because it was bad. Not always, but enough. Enough to leave you drained. Enough to leave you doubting yourself. Enough to make you feel invisible even when you were present. They never saw the way you stayed up overthinking their words. The way you made space for them in your life. They never returned. You did the emotional labor. You carried the weight of both your needs and theirs. You silenced your instincts, ignored the signs, all because you wanted it to work, because you believed people grow, because you thought that maybe if you just held on a little longer, they'd wake up and finally see you, but they didn't. And one day, you realized it wasn't your job to keep fixing a connection they didn't care to maintain. That's when it happens. Quietly. You stop showing up where you're not valued. You stop apologizing for having needs. You stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. And it hurts. It hurts more than anyone tells you. Because love doesn't end when you walk away. Loyalty doesn't disappear overnight. You still think of them. You still wonder if they ever cared. You still check your phone out of habit, hoping maybe this time they'll reach out first, but they don't. Or maybe they do, but only when they notice you've pulled back. Only when they feel your absence, not your pain. And that's when you learn something. That peace and loneliness can look similar from a distance, but they feel nothing alike. Peace is quiet but clean. It doesn't ache the same way. It allows you to breathe, to sleep, to think without second-guessing yourself. You feel the difference the moment you walk away. Not in a grand way, in small things. Waking up without dread. Not having to edit yourself to be accepted. Not sitting in a room full of people and feeling like you don't belong. The courage to leave is not about ego. It's not about proving a point. It's about survival. Emotional survival. Choosing yourself when you finally accept that staying is doing more harm than good. You can't love someone into respecting you. You can't give enough to make someone care. You can only offer what's real, and if that's not enough for them, it has to be enough for you to leave. You don't owe people explanations for choosing peace. Not everyone will understand your silence. Not everyone will appreciate the distance. Some will call you selfish, dramatic, cold, but you know the truth. You know the nights you cried without telling anyone. You know the pain you buried just to keep others comfortable. You know the strength it took to say, "I'm done," not out of bitterness, but because you were finally ready to stop bleeding for people who wouldn't bandage your wounds. I said to him that I would do nothing to render you helpless, not out of bitterness, but because you were finally ready to stop bleeding for people who wouldn't bandage your wounds. Sometimes leaving is the bravest thing you can do. It's the moment you stop choosing pain just because it's familiar. The moment you stop living in fear of being alone and start learning what it means to be free. Not free from others, free from needing to be chosen by those who never truly saw you, free from chasing closure you already gave yourself, free from performing for affection, free from shrinking. The fear doesn't fully go away. That voice still whispers, "What if you were wrong?" But you weren't. You were just finally honest with yourself, with what you need, with what you can no longer tolerate. And that honesty becomes your guide. You learn to trust it. You begin to realize that walking alone with your dignity intact feels better than walking beside someone who makes you question your worth. You walk away not because you hate them, but because you finally love yourself more. And that changes everything. It starts quietly. After the goodbye, after the silence, after you finally walked away, what comes next is often stillness, a strange kind of stillness. No one calls, no one texts, the notifications stop, the noise fades. At first it feels like something is missing. You check your phone out of habit, you reach for conversations that no longer exist, the comfort of chaos, the rhythm of dysfunction. It all goes silent. That silence can feel like a void, but over time it becomes something else, something clean, something honest. You don't realize how heavy it all was until you finally put it down. The weight of trying, the weight of pretending to be okay with less, the weight of shrinking yourself just to fit into spaces that never had room for the real you. When you stand alone, those weights fall off. There's nothing left to perform for, no roles to play, just you in your rawest form. At first, it's uncomfortable. You're used to being surrounded, even if what surrounded you didn't serve you. Then, you start noticing how much better your breathing feels when you're not holding it in. You stop second-guessing your words. You speak freely, even if it's only to yourself. You stop editing your opinions to please others. You begin reclaiming your voice. Not the one that agreed to keep the peace, but the one that speaks the truth, even if it shakes. There's no one around to impress anymore, and somehow that makes your reflection clearer. You start recognizing the person in the mirror again. Or maybe, for the first time, you take your mornings slower. You start choosing what you want to wear, what you want to eat, where you want to go, without having to think about how others will see you. You begin showing up for yourself the way you used to show up for people who rarely showed up for you. It's not about bitterness. It's about balance. You gave so much. Now you pour back into the cup you kept empty for too long. Some days still feel lonely. You question if you did the right thing, if you should have stayed, if you should have settled. But every time you go back to that thought, you remember how it felt to constantly prove your worth, how exhausting it was to explain why you deserved basic kindness, how draining it was to be present for people who never really saw you. Standing alone now feels quieter, but it also feels honest, real, unfiltered. You notice the peace in ordinary things, your own laughter, a book you enjoy, a walk with music. You start protecting your time like it's sacred, because now it is. You're not available for everyone anymore. You no longer say yes when your soul is screaming no. That boundary was built from pain, but it's kept you safe. It taught you that not everyone deserves access to you, especially those who only showed up when they needed something. As time passes, solitude turns into strength. What once felt like isolation starts feeling like clarity. You begin setting standards, not from anger, but from self-awareness. You stop reaching back for people who made you feel small. You stop begging for love that needs to be earned. You now understand that being alone doesn't mean being unwanted. It means being selective. It means knowing the difference between company and connection. Your thoughts become clearer. Your goals start aligning with your values. You find new focus, not driven by competition or comparison, but by purpose. You rest without guilt. You smile without permission. You learn to trust your own rhythm. You no longer rush to fill empty spaces. You let them exist, knowing they're not empty. They're available, reserved for better. And when you look back, it doesn't sting the same way. You stop wondering what you could have done differently. You realize their inability to see your worth had nothing to do with your value. You gave them a front row seat to your loyalty, your love, your heart, and they still missed it. That's not a reflection of your flaws. That's a reflection of their blindness. Standing alone didn't break you. It gave you perspective. It gave you space to grow, to breathe, to rebuild. You stopped trying to fit into places where your presence was tolerated but never cherished. You started building a life that doesn't revolve around being accepted. Instead, it's about being aligned with yourself, with peace, with truth. No more walking on eggshells. No more dimming your light. No more shrinking to make others comfortable. You're standing now, not because there's no one else, but because you finally remembered what it feels like to stand for yourself. And that is a kind of strength they never expected. You walked away quietly, no big announcement, no drama. No one noticed at first. That's how it usually happens when you've been the one giving, the one checking in, the one adjusting. Your absence doesn't cause an earthquake, it causes silence. And at first that silence feels brutal, like you were never needed in the first place, like you never mattered. But slowly, that silence becomes peaceful. You start to hear your own thoughts again. You begin to feel how heavy it all was, how much effort you were putting in to hold it together. And then something unexpected happens. They notice. They start asking where you've been. They ask why you've changed, not because they care in the way you once hoped, but because your energy is missing. Your presence is no longer there to serve their comfort. You were always available, always reachable, always giving more than you had. And now you're not. The messages start to come in, the ones that sound casual but are laced with confusion. Hey, haven't heard from you in a while. You good? Miss seeing you around. It's not that they want to rebuild something meaningful. It's that they're not used to your absence. You were always there, and now they can feel the difference. They ask, but not because they understand. They're surprised because they never thought you'd stop. They thought you would always stay, always forgive, always keep showing up. They underestimated your strength. They didn't think you'd ever get tired, but you did, and you had every right to. There's only so much of yourself you can give away before there's nothing left. They confused kindness with weakness. They mistook your loyalty for dependence. What they failed to see was that you were strong the whole time, not just in leaving, but in all the moments you stayed when you were already breaking. Now you respond differently, or not at all. You don't feel the need to explain anymore. You're not looking for closure. You gave yourself that the moment you chose peace over pleasing. You're no longer desperate for answers that won't come. You're not chasing apologies. You're not rehearsing what to say if they finally get it, because you've changed. And when you change, your silence starts to speak louder than your words ever could. You're no longer the same version of you that tolerated so much for the sake of connection. It's not about bitterness. You don't hate them. You're not angry anymore. You've just healed past the point of needing them to see your side. What they do or don't understand doesn't keep you up at night. You've built peace without their validation. That's something they'll never control again. And what stings for them now is realizing they lost something solid, something genuine, someone who cared, showed up and meant what they said. They realize too late that presence doesn't beg to be noticed. It just disappears, and its absence does the talking. Now they remember the things you did, the way you listened, the way you stayed loyal, the way you never asked for much but gave everything. They begin to replay the conversations they once brushed off. They revisit moments when you tried to express how you felt. Back then, they didn't hear you. Now they wish they had. You don't feel the need to say, "I told you so." You don't feel anything but relief for no longer waiting for them to change. You stopped writing chapters for people who kept skipping pages. You gave them chances, more than they deserved, but growth requires choices, and your choice was to stop shrinking to fit into places that didn't make room for you. You didn't walk away because you stopped caring. You walked away because they stopped showing up, and now they realized they were never carrying the connection. You were. They just got used to the weight being on your shoulders. Now that you've put it down, they feel it. They notice your silence, your calm, your energy pulled back. You no longer trying. You no longer asking. You no longer explaining, and that quiet hurts more than any loud goodbye. Because it means you've outgrown the version of you who tolerated being unseen. It means you found peace that doesn't require their permission, and the moment they realize you're no longer available to them in the way you used to be, they start to feel the loss. But by then, you've already healed. You've already moved on. And you've already learned the most important thing of all. Your value was never up for debate. It was always there. They just didn't know how to see it. Now, you don't need them to. Something shifts once you walk away from people who never valued you. At first it feels like a void. You've spent so long trying to fit in that emptiness feels unfamiliar. But it's not emptiness. It's space. Space you never had before. Space you used to fill with overthinking, pleasing, proving. Now it's quiet. And in that quiet, something else begins. You start noticing what you once ignored. You start asking harder questions. Who am I when I'm not performing? What do I want if no one else is influencing me? You stop reacting to everything. You pause. You reflect. You remember moments where you laughed too quickly just to belong. You recall conversations where you nodded along even when your chest was tight with disagreement. That version of you was doing their best. They thought approval meant connection. They thought being liked was the same as being loved. But now, things are different. You begin to rebuild, not just yourself, but your boundaries. You're not looking for attention anymore. You're looking for alignment. You no longer want people who tolerate you when it's easy. You want people who respect you when it's hard. And that means your standards rise, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. When you've been ignored, dismissed, or misunderstood for too long, you realize how important it is to be around people who actually see you, who hear you, who don't wait for you to finish just so they can talk. Real conversations become more valuable than surface connections. Genuine energy becomes more precious than forced loyalty. You start asking yourself, does this feel safe? Not just, do they like me? People who come into your life now have to meet the new version of you, the one that knows how to say no without guilt, the one that can walk away mid-sentence if the vibe isn't right. Not out of arrogance, but because your peace has become non-negotiable. You've spent too many nights doubting yourself to hand over access easily again. Now, effort is required. This new circle you're creating, it's smaller, quieter, maybe even slower to form, but it's real. You're not rushing connection anymore. You're watching how people act when they're not getting what they want. You're noticing how they respond when you say no. You're listening not just to what they say, but what they never say. You catch silence. You pay attention to absence. You observe who shows up when you don't have anything to offer but your truth. It's not about perfection. It's about consistency, loyalty, integrity. You're learning to value those things because you've been hurt by the lack of them. You used to think love was supposed to be loud, messy, complicated. Now you understand that love can be quiet. It can look like showing up, like listening, like not having to explain yourself all the time. You've grown into someone who holds standards, not to push people away, but to protect what you've rebuilt. Your heart isn't guarded, it's guided. There's a difference. You know who you are now. You don't chase, beg, or convince anymore. You attract what mirrors you, what respects your time, what honors your voice. Some people won't understand this version of you. They'll say you've changed, that you're too distant, too picky, too proud. But you'll smile, because you know they never saw the real you to begin with. They knew the version of you that bent to fit their comfort, not the version that learned to stand tall, even when standing alone. You notice red flags sooner now. You stop entertaining what once kept you emotionally hostage. You don't argue with people committed to misunderstanding you. You don't overextend for those who've shown they'll never do the same. You let people go without explanation, not because you don't care, but because explaining your worth is something you're done doing. Now, when someone enters your space, they meet someone whole, someone who doesn't tolerate inconsistency, someone who doesn't confuse availability with value. You've stopped being the one who always reaches out first, the one who always makes excuses for others. You're teaching people how to treat you by showing how you treat yourself. This isn't bitterness. This is boundaries. This isn't loneliness. This is self-respect. You've learned that it's better to sit in silence than to shrink in someone else's presence. You've learned that peace isn't found in company. It's found in clarity. And once you have that, you stop settling. You're not hard to love. You're just no longer willing to accept half-hearted love. You're not unkind. You're just uninterested in people who only show up when it's convenient. You're not closed off. You're just no longer open to those who confuse access with entitlement. You're building something real now. A life that reflects your worth, not your wounds. A circle that's small, but solid. And this time, you don't have to pretend. This time, you're choosing people who choose you back. Not because they need you, but because they see you. You gave chances, more than you should have. You excused their silence, their distance, their inconsistency. You told yourself they were just busy, just distracted, just tired. But they weren't. They were just not choosing you. And you stayed because the history felt heavier than your own peace. You held on because you didn't want to be alone, but the truth is you already were. You were surrounded by people who didn't hear you, who didn't see you, who didn't value the effort you kept making in silence. You finally stopped, not because you hated them, but because you started loving yourself more than the pain they caused. You stopped explaining your worth. You stopped trying to fit in where you clearly didn't belong. It wasn't an angry exit. There were no fireworks, just a quiet decision to stop shrinking, to stop giving to those who took you for granted. That's what real self-respect looks like. It doesn't scream, it simply walks away. You've changed since then, not bitter, just clear. You're not interested in temporary people anymore, not interested in half-hearted energy, in inconsistent friendships, in empty promises. You've learned to prefer your own silence over meaningless noise, and now you can see it clearly. Being alone is not the same as being abandoned. Being alone, when it's your choice, is a statement. It says, I'd rather have my own back than beg for someone else's attention. The people you left behind, they noticed. Maybe not immediately, but over time they felt it. Your absence was louder than your presence ever was. Because when someone who constantly gave suddenly stops, it echoes. They might come back with apologies, with confusion, with phrases like, you've changed, as if you weren't allowed to grow. But you know better now. You won't be guilted into returning. You're not angry, just done. It hurts, still. That's honest. Walking away doesn't erase the attachment. You remember the moments, the laughs, the times it felt real. But you also remember the hurt, the one-sided effort, the heavy feeling in your chest when you left a conversation feeling smaller. That's not love. That's not respect. That's emotional debt. And you've paid it long enough. Now, you protect your energy. You choose where you place your time. You move slowly with people. You no longer explain your standards. They either meet you where you are or they stay where they were. You're not better than anyone. You're just better to yourself now. That matters. You've walked away, but not empty. You've walked away with your dignity intact, and that's the real win. It's better to stand alone and feel peace than to walk beside people who make you question your worth. You no longer chase closeness that costs you your voice. You choose truth. You choose self-respect. You choose peace. And in that space, you finally found something real. Yourself. And that, right there, is everything they failed to value.